Hello and welcome to the Week 8 edition of the Power Grid. It's the Footballguys.com daily fantasy show. I'm your host, Austin Lee, and I'm joined, as always, by John Lee, Jeff Pasquino, Devin Knotts, and Ryan Hester. Let's dive into it, fellas. We're going to talk about Vegas first. But before we get to Vegas, there's 6 teams on the bye we're not going to talk about, and we're going to try not to talk about Thursday Night Football or Monday Night Football or the London game. So we're focused on the main slate, which is 9 games on DraftKings, 10 games on FanDuel. All right, let's get into Vegas. John, I'm going to kick it to you. You always do our Tuesday Vegas Value Charts article. What is Vegas telling you now?
Some big favorites this week, Austin. Philadelphia playing at home against San Francisco. This is a team last week, San Francisco, that allowed Ezekiel Elliott to score 40 DraftKings points. And so they're really bad against running backs, and we have some questions to ask about LeGarrette Blount and his ability to run the score up against a team that has had that happen to them 7 times this year. They're 12.5-point underdogs, and the implied point total for the Eagles this week is approaching 30, which is highest on the game slate. Outside of that, other big favorites, you've got New Orleans Saints. Kudos to Mark Ingram there. You've got the New England Patriots. Some questions about who's going to get the running action on that team. Cincinnati Bengals, more questions. Maybe we can talk about that as well. And the other 2 are games that we probably won't talk about this evening. The point here is that there are several big favorites. And when we have big favorites, we need to be talking about the running backs on those squads because they will be getting additional opportunities more than likely late in the game.
Yeah, and so there's those 4 big games sort of at the top of the implied totals. Jeff, what's another game that's maybe a little bit down the list of implied totals that piques your interest for DFS?
I think there's a lot of sneaky options this week. I really like the Buffalo-Oakland game to score a lot of points. I think that we could see a lot of Tyrod Taylor this week and LeSean McCoy. And I really like the Oakland game. I think that's a great GPP option for Derek Carr. Should be low-owned and 2 wide receivers because they're not going to be able to run the ball this week.
Yeah, and some people may be off of that because of the West Coast team traveling east. But, even if they have a rough start, maybe they get some trash time action in that one. Ryan, is there another game that you see on this slate that you like?
Yeah, actually, I like Carolina and Tampa Bay. Especially from a GPP perspective, a lot of people are going to be on the Eagles. As John mentioned, the big favorites, New England and the Chargers are going to get a lot of players in that game. But we know Cam Newton has GPP upside because of his running. Tampa has allowed 13 wide receivers this season to have double-digit PPR fantasy points. So even if you don't know which Carolina guy to play, you could play Cam Newton on his own because of his running ability. You could stack him with Christian McCaffrey, who has one of the league's best market shares, even among all players, let alone the fact that he's a running back. So there's a lot of options there. And then, of course, Deshaun Jackson is getting his floor this year is 6 targets in any one game. So he has a built-in floor of volume, and then we always know that he can go deep and take the lid off the defense and have a ceiling as well. A lot of guys in that game that you could stack up and go on both sides. So I'm looking at that one pretty heavily.
Yeah, and the Bucs are going to be without cornerbacks Brent Grimes and Robert McClain in this game, which just makes it even easier for this to turn into a shootout. Devin, what do you think about this Dallas-Washington game? That seems to be the highest point total of the week. Do you see this one being filled with DFS goodness?
Yeah, it's interesting because, and we'll get to it in a little bit, but Washington's run defense has actually been really solid this year. So it's a little bit surprising as far as why this game is the highest total. They have Dallas as a 2-point favorite. So Josh Norman's back for Washington, or at least he's supposed to be. So I'm actually kind of surprised that that's one of the highest game totals this year or this season or this week. Yeah. But we'll see. I think it's not as good of a matchup as for Dallas as what Vegas is saying, but they know what they're doing. So it's something to at least look at.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we want to tease apart here too is, which of these games do we think are going to go a different way than maybe Vegas is saying? So let's go right into quarterbacks here. No real injuries here that affect the main slate. Ryan, I'll pitch it to you first. Who do you like at quarterback this week?
Yeah, I like a couple guys. First of all, if you're looking to go cheap, especially on DraftKings, where we know that they, price quarterbacks, a little bit lower. Andy Dalton gets Indianapolis. It's a bad defense. I mean, and a really bad pass defense. Second most passing yards in the league allowed. Most net pass yards per attempt allowed. And Dalton has A.J. Green, obviously, and Tyler Kroft is scoring touchdowns at a high rate. So I like Dalton a lot. I think he's 5,100 there at DraftKings. So he's kind of the cheap option. And then the other one that I really
5,700 over
57. Sorry
but
about that.
He is the cheap option. Yeah,
he is the mid to cheap option that you want.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll try to stay non-chalky and leave. I'm sure there's going to be a discussion about a certain quarterback from Philadelphia here later. But the other guy I like is Russell Wilson. Their implied team total is 25. They have no running game to speak of. I think you could maybe play back the tape from last week when I said all these same things. But I still like to look when Seattle has a high team total towards him. He is the running game. He is the passing game. So he's going to score the points. And so I like Russell Wilson a lot. Might be more of a GPP play given his price point, but he does have a high ceiling there too. So I'm liking him.
Devin raised the red black-eyed Joe and Russell Wilson. Lions raises it back. Oh God,
the only thing I'll say about Houston is that Kevin Johnson looks like he's going to be playing this week. So if he's playing, that's a significantly worse matchup than what Houston's been all year. So Kevin Johnson is a pretty good corner. So that's the only hesitation I have with. I agree that he's a GPT play. I would just have some caution in cash.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Ryan mentioned the Philly quarterback Jeff as our resident Eagles guy. Do you think Wentz is the chalk this week?
I think he is the chalk on FanDuel, just because of the pricing. I think he's like seventh priced quarterback there. Well, he's tied for sixth with Russell Wilson. So I think he's going to be the chalk there, and that's an easy way to get exposure to that game and a big piece of it because it's going to be hard to figure out which wide receiver, or is it's going to be Zach Ertz, or is Wentz going to run it in himself. So that's probably the very smart cash play for the quarterback at FanDuel. On DraftKings, I think it is Andy Dalton for cash. I mentioned a couple of GPP options earlier. I think that you definitely got Derek Carr. I like the Cam Newton pick. I think Phillip Rivers is in the discussion too. I think that's even though it's an early game, and I don't buy that narrative all the time. I think Rivers is used to doing this, and that's great. We know how bad the New England defense is, and I think that there's plenty of targets for him to move the ball, put up another 300-yard game.
Yeah, I think the quarterback pricing is more creative over on DraftKings this week than on FanDuel, where I feel like FanDuel, it seems pretty obvious who to play in cash, whereas DraftKings, I think there's a few different options there. Devin, who do you like at quarterback this week?
Yeah, I think a lot of them have been mentioned, but I think the one that I'll go with is Cam Newton. So Carolina is actually in a pretty good spot this week. So the Buccaneers' pass defense, as you mentioned, is absolutely ravaged with injuries. Brent Grimes is out. And the Buccaneers are 32nd against the pass in terms of DVOA. So they've allowed their receivers this is a really good spot for Carolina. So who knows? We've seen Tampa just get annihilated. We saw it against Arizona a couple weeks ago. So this is a really good spot for Cam Newton as well as some of the receivers in this game.
Yeah, I completely agree. When I look at DraftKings cash, I'm leaning towards Dalton because of the cash savings there.
Can we talk about that for a second? Are we really starting Andy Dalton in cash?
Well, when I try to do my builds over at DraftKings in cash, it's very challenging. Like I'm looking at like Kirk Cousins and Cam Newton, like bumping up a little bit, but it's tight, man.
Andy Dalton's floor just scares me.
Oh, sure,
really,
certainly.
In cash, it was really scary.
If you're going to take a chance at quarterback or at any position, it's going to be the quarterback position because it is the most consistent position from week to week. And there is really no value, maybe outside of Josh Doctson this week on DraftKings. It's really difficult. I was trying to build a cash game roster earlier, and I hate it. I hate the roster. I mean, there's only 9 games to choose from. And, if we say that a third of those, and I think that's being kind, a third of those are throwaway games, you basically got 10 to 12 teams to choose from. It's really tough. I'm not necessarily saying that I disagree with you, Devin. it's tough to pull the trigger on Dalton. But if you don't, you're really going to be scrounging elsewhere this week because there's no value on DraftKings.
My goal the rest of this show is to convince you guys not to play Andy Dalton.
I like
Challenge accepted.
So help us find the value at other places. Now, Jeff, you raised a red black-eyed Joe. What do you got?
Well, I just want to throw the one name out that I mentioned earlier, which is Tyrod Taylor. I think that he's a viable cash option this week. I think on DraftKings he's only $200 more than Dalton.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out why I don't have Tyrod Taylor on my short list here.
Because his matchup isn't as good as Andy Dalton's?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, I'm not saying that it's completely out there, but he didn't make my short list at all.
If I can, I think what John meant, hopefully, when he said most consistent position is that quarterback's the most predictable position based on matchup. These guys have a built-in volume. If you look down at, QB 12, QB 14, and then we extrapolate down at running backs and say running back 24, 25, those guys don't have built-in volume. Quarterbacks do. And they do against bad defenses sometimes. And that's what we have with Andy Dalton. And that's why DraftKings pricing is so much more challenging than FanDuel, because they'll throw you that bone at quarterback, but only at quarterback. And so sometimes you just have to take it. I mean, there was a couple weeks ago, Brian Hoyer. I said, wow, do I really want to play Brian Hoyer in cash? And I did, and it worked out really well. And I'm sure I can think of examples where it didn't. But this allows you to get these guaranteed touches into your lineup, and at no other position does a guy 10, 20 or lower have those guaranteed touches.
If you were to listen about the Bears defense, that would have been a nice savings last week.
I played the Chargers.
Not the Bears, though.
Yeah, the Bears, that was a good call, Devin, for sure. Give us more calls like that to save cash so that we can save ourselves from Andy Dalton. Maybe we'll find those options at running back. There's really not a whole lot to talk about in terms of injuries here either. Marshawn Lynch is suspended, so we probably have to talk about those Oakland running backs since they're so cheap. Not really any relevant injuries in terms of the main slate, though. John, I'll kick it to you first on running back. What do you see here? Do you see any value?
I don't. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying. You could look at these Oakland running backs, DeAndre Washington. You can look at Jalon Richard and say, maybe one of these guys is a play against Buffalo. But if we knew that Buffalo was going to blow them out, then maybe you say Richard gets more looks because he's a passing down back and that gives him some added value. But neither one of them is 3,000, 3,500. I think they're both on DraftKings north of 4,000. I want to say 4,100, 4,500, something like this.
Yeah, Washington's 41 and Richard is 4,300.
Yeah, so on that end, neither one of those guys are a lock for even a dozen touches. And so for me, I'm avoiding both of them. The only value play, and I think I'll let it to some of you guys to talk about, is Joe Mixon. I will say, excuse me, that I named Joe Mixon as my fool's gold play last night on the Roto-Grinders Footballguys show. I think that he is fool's gold in the sense of value. And so if you're eliminating these Oakland Raiders running backs,
based on what?
Based on a number of things. He did not play the second half last week, despite having a really good first half. And Coach Lewis, he calls Coach Lewis out after the game as a rookie. It's just a no-no. You don't do that. And Lewis has come back. He didn't back away and say, you know what, he's right. He outperformed what I thought he would. I made a mistake. And we've been hearing that elsewhere in the league, where we're like, oh, we need to get this guy additional touches. Lewis didn't say that when he was confronted. He's like, look, we're going to do what we need to do, and I'm not going to let this rookie. Basically, he said, I'm not going to let the rookie badmouth me, and I would not be surprised if he pays for that this week in terms of playing time. It's just a personal take home from that, and I'm not paying $4,700 for him. I can tell you that. I think that's too much money for the risk that comes with it.
And then Bill Lazor sort of followed that up, backing up the head coach there, kind of saying the same thing. Like, the coaches have got this. Like, we know how to use our three backs better than, our one back.
But this Colts run defense is so bad.
Oh,
sure,
and
they started off the season great. They lost John Simon to injury, and over the last 2 weeks, they've been horrible.
Sure, but why can't Jeremy Hill or Gio Bernard beat them? What just to prove a point to the rookie that look, you got to know your place on the squad.
I think it has more to do with the fumble that he had than anything else, and just knowing that they can't have another fumble in that game. To me, it's where else are – I mean, unless you want to go with Andy Dalton, I don't. I think that Mixon gets, 13 to 15 touches? And you may take the under on that, but 13 to 15 touches against this defense, we saw what TJ Yeldon did with 9. So, and Derrick Henry busted a long run. I think Mixon is at least intriguing. Well,
you know who's going to have 35 touches against this Colts defense? Andy Dalton.
Okay.
Well, right. to be clear, just on what John said, I mean, Mixon did play the second half. He just didn't get a lot of touches, but not a lot of the Bengals did. AJ Green had 0 catches after the first quarter of the game, so they just didn't do anything. And Mixon's complaint was that they were passing too much. They had a lot of short drives, 3 and outs, and also threw 2 interceptions. So that's an easy thing to complain about when you're throwing interceptions. Granted, he shouldn't have done it, but he was out there and he was their best player.
Remind me, who's the quarterback throwing interceptions?
I wouldn't start him against the Steelers. Quarterback's a matchup position.
Jeff, bring us to some more running back options here, either expensive or cheap. Who do you like this week?
Wow.
Go expensive.
I think you do have to look expensive, and I think you can look a little bit off the top tier. I think I mentioned McCoy earlier. Le'Veon Bell is going to be highly owned, I think, on FanDuel just because it's the only place you can play him on the main slate. Yep. Zeke is going to have a lot of interest, but I think if you go a tier down, you can find a couple options. Mark Ingram is definitely playable. Melvin Gordon is definitely playable. I think Christian McCaffrey is also definitely playable on both sites, not just a PPR site, because he's getting enough touches. I'm on the fence on the Joe Mixon debate. I do like his price. I just don't know what to do with him. I was playing while these guys were yelling at each other. I was trying to build a few lines while we were looking at it. And it is tough. It is tough if you don't really go down on defense or wide receiver or 2 tight ends or something. So, if we talk about building strategy, I think that a 2 tight end week is definitely viable on DraftKings because that's how you save money. But it's tight otherwise. I think you're really looking at the top 5 to 6 prices on running backs for the most part.
Let's see, Ryan, any interest in a LeGarrette Blount against San Francisco's awful run defense?
I mean, I did come across something earlier this week that since the beginning of last year, the overall RB4 in PPR fantasy points is the one playing San Francisco. That's nice, but Smallwood came back last week and looked better and should be in on passing downs as well. So there's some interest. It's probably just a GPP thing and hope he gets a couple of touchdowns. I am hearing, and I think, John and I talked about it before the show, that the weather there should be kind of bad, maybe rainy. And so if that is the case, maybe they just throw the mutter out there and let him have 15 to 20 carries. But the lack of clarity and the lack of volume is a little bit troubling, even though the matchup is very good.
Yeah, and the price is only $5,100. Devin, tell me.
Speaking of the Eagles, I actually prefer Smallwood in this game. So the 49ers have really struggled against pass-catching running backs. So they've allowed 100 yards to Todd Gurley, Chris Thompson, and then they allowed 76 yards and a touchdown to Ezekiel Elliott last week. The problem with running up the middle with Blount is that ultimately he's going to be going up against DeForest Buckner, who's probably one of, if not the best run-stopping defensive tackle in football. And most of the runs that San Francisco has allowed is on the outside. So Wendell Smallwood's actually a guy that I'm looking at pretty closely. The other guy that I'm looking at is Chris Thompson for Washington. So the Cowboys they've either been very good or they've been very bad against the run. So Todd Gurley, they allowed 121 yards, and Aaron Jones, they allowed 125 yards. So they've actually faced 4 teams that are ranked in the bottom 10 against the run. So don't just look at their overall run stats because they faced some pretty bad rushing offenses. Actually look at the Redskins running attack this week.
So I liked Jeff's Melvin Gordon pick earlier. I want to add that the Patriots are going to be without Donta Hightower. He's been ruled out for the year with a torn pectoral muscle, so that hurts the already hurting Patriots run defense. I've got another running back here. He's got 25 touches per game over the last 5 games, and he's facing the team that allows the 5th most normalized fantasy points to running backs, Jordan Howard. Any interest here from Jordan Howard? Let me see the Black-Eyed Joes. Does anybody have any maybe GPP interest in Jordan Howard? No, John's like, I ain't having any of it. Nobody's having any of it. All right. Oh, well.
10-point underdogs, that's why.
Well, he's still getting the volume even when they're getting beaten into a pulp. So, like, it's –
their quarterback throws 7 passes a week.
They haven't been beaten into a pulp, though, recently, have they?
Well, their defense has held it kind of close usually. Their defense is – yeah, Devin's like the Bears' defense.
All the money.
All the money is for the Bears' defense. All right, let's see. Any other running back picks before we move on to receivers? Anybody got anyone that didn't get mentioned? All right, let's move on and find some value at the receiver position. We got a couple injuries here worth watching. Danny Amendola looks questionable with a knee injury. He was in limited practice on Thursday. It's tough to tell with the Patriots. Maybe he'll be fine, but just keep an eye on it. And then Marquise Goodwin didn't practice on Thursday. I don't think he's going to go this week, but keep an eye on that situation as well. And then Sunday Night Football, if you're playing that over on FanDuel, has a whole bunch of injury issues going on. Golden Tate may or may not play. Kenny Golladay looks like he's not going to play. And then Martavis Bryant is out because of back talk and other shenanigans. Yes, Ryan, tell us, what is Team Find Juju's bike? Speaking of the Steelers and Sunday Night Football, what is that?
Just follow Team Juju on Twitter and scroll through the timeline from this week. It's fantastic. It's so entertaining.
Okay, excellent. Are you looking to Juju Smith-Schuster as a potential FanDuel play on the main slate?
I wish that this game were in the DraftKings main slate because I would be, because he's cheaper relative to other guys over there. But I mean, it sounds like a lot. $1,000 is a lot, I guess. But Nelson Agholor is $6,000 while Juju Smith-Schuster is $5,000. So I don't know that I'm going to play him a lot. I just want to follow him on Twitter and be really entertained.
Right. Well, and you bring up a good question. I think that a lot of the Eagles' skill position players are in consideration here. Yep. Who do you like more, Alshon Jeffrey or Nelson Agholor?
I like Jeffrey. The matchup is so good. I mean, all the Niners corners are really bad. Surprise, Devin disagrees.
Love Agholor.
But there's a lot of and this might even be a little narrative streety, so I don't normally like going that way, but the matchups that Jeffrey has faced all year have just been unbelievably bad. I mean, this guy has faced off against every good corner in the league, and next week they play Denver, so he's going to face off against another couple of good corners. Why not get your guy going? I mean, and part of the reason Zach Ertz has been so good could be because Jeffrey's been locked up. So the Niners are kind of the opposite of what Philly has done so far this year. They're the best against tight end in fantasy points, I believe, if not one of the best, and terrible against wide receivers. So if Philly just plays to the weaknesses of their opponent, they'll throw the ball to Jeffrey more than they do to Ertz. And I think this is the week to get him going and maybe keep his interest a little bit. So I like Jeffrey better than Agholor, even at the price.
But Devin disagrees. Why is that?
Yeah, I do the Eagles write-ups for Football Guys. And one of the things that I've noticed is that, yes, you're right, early on in the season he faced a gauntlet of tough corners. He's faced Carolina and Washington without Josh Norman the last 2 weeks, and he still hasn't done anything. So meanwhile, Nelson Agholor has scored a touchdown in 3 straight games. He has more of a deep threat. And he's out of the slot going against Kwan Williams, who might be the worst cornerback in football. And I'm sure John may disagree with all the behind-the-scenes cornerback discussion that he does, but this is a big-time matchup for Agholor. I think he has more upside, and I think their floor is probably about the same, but I think Agholor has more upside.
John, let me ask you. Hey, Dontrell Inman got traded to the Bears, but no one can replace Marcus Wheaton in John's heart. Tell us of your heartbreak.
Yeah, I mean, this would be a great week to land on one of these Bears wide receivers, because they should be throwing the ball a heck of a lot more than 7 times this week. That said, I mean, can you look at Inman? I don't think you can. No. He's got to get to know the system. You still have Marshawn Lattimore there in New Orleans, who's a really, really good cornerback, rookie cornerback in New Orleans. It's something they've been needing for almost this side of a decade. I don't think there's anything to like about this Bears passing game this week. So I think you completely avoid it.
Yeah.
To go back 2 minutes and potentially, hopefully not stir the pot any longer. I think both of these guys are in play this week. Alshon Jeffrey and Agholor are both in play this week. For the reasons that both of these guys mentioned, I don't think that one of them is a bad play over the other. And maybe that's the conundrum. Maybe that's how you attack it. You say, look, who's going to be lower owned? Because to me, they look to be equally attractive. I will point out, I am the resident Philly guy. I came home from work this afternoon, and Glenn Hurricane Schwartz, who is our local, steadfast meteorologist, said that as of today, now we're recording this Thursday night, as of today, the forecast for the game, during game time, they're calling for inches of rain during the game. If that occurs, and wind conditions up to 20 miles per hour, if that occurs, I think that heavily favors the running game. And, you're not going to be able to check back with us live. We're all doing our thing on Twitter, and certainly you should do that. I think Devin's been really good about answering some questions on YouTube, on our channel over there. So definitely check in there, and we can report back as to what's going on in the 11th hour. That said, definitely check in with Vegas, because Vegas will adjust the line accordingly if the weather that is supposedly coming our way does hit.
That's a good point. We'll definitely have to watch that. At the same time, I don't want anyone to overreact to the weather. I think far too many times I've seen rain, oh my gosh, and then, it doesn't really affect the game at all. So
look at the wind numbers too. So the wind numbers are often now, if it's inches of rain, that's a big deal. But if it's less than an inch of rain, don't be scared off unless the wind is actually matters.
Yeah. What do you think that threshold is? Is it 20?
For me, I start getting nervous above 15.
Yeah.
I'm very nervous above 20. So that's how I typically play it.
Yeah. It's 20 for me. I think that's the cutoff, because, it makes these forecasters, they want to make headlines, right? So if it's 15, I think in reality, Devin's right. It's 15, but these guys, they want to say, well, it's up to 20, and then people start listening. So for our purposes, let's call it 20. And the biggest thing, as you're pointing out, Austin, follow Vegas. If Vegas drops that line 2 points on Sunday morning, it's a real issue.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right. Since Andy Dalton's going to have an amazing week, that means AJ Green is the chalk too. Jeff, would you agree with that? Who else you got?
Yeah, I think AJ Green is the chalk. The other guy I'm looking at, the two guys I'm looking at the higher end, I'm trying to get in are Michael Thomas and Keenan Allen. I think those are two guys that I think are in good spots to catch a lot of passes. But I think just doing a build on FanDuel, you need to find somebody that's a value. That's why that Juju Schuster's out there. You got let's see, who else was looking in the 500 range. It's a little dicey down there. I think I'm looking at Marvin Jones is I like him, but he's a little bit pricier. I've got options. You got one? Go ahead, throw one out there while I find a couple more.
Shout out to our colleague Dan Hendry, who behind the scenes we have a couple chats, and Dan lives in Cincy. He's a resident Cincy guy, so he came up with this one, but I'll give him some props here. But
don't say Brandon LaFell.
Brandon LaFell plays for Cincinnati. It's either Brandon LaFell or Tyler Kroft, so it's Brandon LaFell. But again, it's matchup, right? So I'm not recommending it in cash because you can do better, especially on FanDuel. But LaFell is 4,600 there. He's 3,700 on DraftKings. Indy's second worst in the NFL against the pass. They're better against wide receiver ones than they are against wide receiver twos, according to DVOA numbers. So they haven't seen an AJ Green, so I'd still prefer AJ Green, obviously. But LaFell,
why not
is
just
somebody,
go Josh
if
Doctson?
you're scraping the bottom. Why
Because
not?
you might have to do both on DraftKings.
Yeah.
But I mean, I want a piece of Cincy's passing game. So if you're not going to have Dalton and you're not going to have Green, I don't,
I think
I'm not playing Croft on
there.
FanDuel. Well, not on FanDuel. His price isn't as good. So LaFell's another option. Just wanted to get it out there.
Yes.
And wanted to shout out Dan because he knows his stuff.
Well,
Yes, yeah, he does. Jeff,
Well-
back to you. What else you got?
Well, Ryan and Devin have their lovers quarrel for yet another time. I found I think Josh Doctson is definitely in play to be considered, but I'm also going to look at the Buffalo situation again. I think that the Oakland defense can be exploited through the air. You had Deontay Thompson saw a lot of targets last week, but Jordan Matthews should be back. But I think those are two lower end guys that could be seeing a good enough amount of targets and catches to be valuable as a wide receiver 3. Also looking at Tyler Lockett for Seattle at 5,200. I think that's, you are scraping a little bit of the bottom of the barrel here, but you're trying to find a couple $100. Jameson Crowder is also in play. So I think the Washington receivers and somebody in Buffalo, whoever looks to be the number 1, is probably where I'm looking for my cheap guy.
Yeah, some other guys I'll throw out before we move on to the next position. I've got Kelvin Benjamin's price at FanDuel feels especially low at 6,600. That matchup is amazing. We already mentioned that matchup, but I think he's playable on both, but especially on FanDuel. Let's see.
What about Ted Ginn?
Ted Ginn, yes, Ted Ginn. John
Not
loves
at Panthers, but I have a signed helmet.
About Ted Ginn.
I'll let Jeff do it since he called him out.
Okay.
No, I think he's a good play. At 5,900, he's seeing a lot of targets in that offense. Granted, he's going up against the Bears, but I think that, with some weather involved, I think that you got Drew Brees in a dome, and Ted Ginn sees plenty of targets. That's a solid wide receiver 3 option.
Yeah, especially if you're trying to find salary relief here. I also would take a look at Chris Hogan as a GPP play with Amendola banged up and Cooks probably locked up by Casey Hayward here. I think Hogan's the GPP receiver I want from the Patriots. And then Doug Baldwin's kind of in that upper range for GPP plays. I think he's worth a look.
I got one more.
What's that?
I got one more.
Give me one more.
Marquise Goodwin. So extremely cheap. He's as a GPP play, just 3,900. He's had 80 yards in 2 of his last 3 games. Both of those games, he saw 8 plus targets. So one of them he saw 11 targets. One of them he saw 8 targets. Going up against a Philly defense that's been the best in football and the best that we've seen in the past couple of years against the run. And if this game turns into a blowout and the weather holds, so Goodwin's a deep threat, you have to be careful about that. But if the weather holds up, Goodwin is a guy who could get behind this defense.
Yeah, I wish that he was healthy. If he's healthy and the weather holds, I like the situation. He did not practice on Thursday.
Correct.
But that doesn't mean he's going to be out. So
if he's not healthy, why not Trent Taylor?
And that's an interesting one. Like, I'm looking a little bit at Trent Taylor because he's especially cheap. But tell me more that you might be interested.
I mean, he's $3,200 on DraftKings.
Right.
And he saw 5 targets last week, and he's the 49ers are going to be behind. He's a slot guy. I think that he's a guy that you could in a GPP or even in cash. All he needs at 3,200 is 9 points, and he's fine.
Yeah, John, you've got something you want to add to this before we move on to tight ends?
Yeah, and I won't make it long because we're belaboring a point about a situation that is probably only GPP worthy.
Yeah.
But in week 4, Marquise Goodwin left with an injury of some sort, and in that game, both Trent Taylor and Aldrick Robinson ended up with double-digit targets. I think both of these guys, if Marquise Goodwin does not play, merit consideration given what we think is going to be a pass-heavy game script. But let's not forget it's C.J. Beathard throwing the ball and not Hoyer. And to some level, I think that should temper our enthusiasm because last week Beathard did not look good in his NFL debut.
Yeah. Let's talk tight ends. I don't have any injuries here. I think that one way you can find salary relief over on DraftKings is to play double tight end, even in cash, because some of these tight ends at the lower price range have a higher floor, I feel like, than some of the low-priced receivers. That's, feels dicey as a general concept, but the past couple of weeks, I feel like we've had some good tight end matchups. Ryan, kick us off on tight ends. Who are a couple of guys you like?
Yeah, on DraftKings, it's Tyler Kroft. He's only 3,000. So it's just very hard to find anybody worth anything. Devin doesn't like Cincy's passing game, but their total's so high, so I'm still not sure who he likes. I guess they just won't score
Jason
points.
Witten.
On FanDuel, it is, as a matter of fact, Jason Witten is the guy that I was going to say. He's 300 cheaper than Kroft on FanDuel, and he's even under Hunter Henry, Jared Cook, and even lower price than Eric Ebron, the ghost of Eric Ebron at FanDuel. So I like Witten on FanDuel. I like Kroft on DraftKings.
Do you get points for hype if you buy Ebron? Like maybe that would make it worthwhile. Devin, you said Witten. Tell me more.
Yeah. Washington's allowed the second most points to opposing tight ends this season. Witten's in a really good spot. He's been a primary focus in this offense. He's only 4,200 on DraftKings, so he's a perfect guy if you were to say, hey, I am starting Tyler Kroft, but I don't have really flexibility anywhere. I would look at Jason Witten out of the tight end spot. I mean, he's had 50 yards in both of his last two games. He saw 10 targets 2 weeks ago against Green Bay. Didn't see a ton of targets last week, but the game was really out of hand early. But he caught all four that he saw. So he's a guy that in this matchup, especially with Josh Norman back, it should be very favorable for Witten.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. John, I know you like Witten. I think you mentioned him on last night's show. Tell me about another guy you like.
There's not a whole lot else I like at the tight end position. I think these guys are talking about some of the big ones. You know, a couple guys I'll be fading this week. It's really it almost hurts my heart to say it, but I think I'll be fading Gronk this week. The Chargers have been pretty darn good against the tight end position, and the opportunity cost there is so high that I want to get away from it. And for the same reasons, and I think that Devin already mentioned this, but Zach Ertz is probably a guy that you could fade this week as well too, because of if San Francisco has done very, very little right this year, but one thing they have done is defend the tight end position well. And, for that reason, these guys that we're typically looking to for big games from the tight end position, this week maybe it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spend a lot of money there. So I know that's not the question you asked me, but I think it's worth mentioning at this point in the discussion.
The one thing I'll say about Ertz real quick is that San Francisco is starting to turn. So they've allowed six receptions and 80 yards over the last 2 weeks to Washington and Dallas. So there might be a trend there that it should be low ownership because everyone's looking at the exact same thing, that San Francisco has been good, but over the last 2 weeks they have struggled. So you should be able to get Ertz at a lower ownership.
Yeah, I think maybe he's worth a GPP play because of those last 2 weeks where they've started to show a little bit of weakness. DraftKings only due to the pricing. I am willing to go with Jimmy Graham or Jordan Reed. Jimmy Graham is only 4,600. Reed only 4,700. Over on FanDuel, they're priced too high for me to invest in those guys. Jeff, tell me about tight end.
Yeah, I got one name I'm going to throw out there, and then I want to play a little brief game. So sure. I think we should talk about Hunter Henry. I think Hunter Henry is definitely in play against New England. I think that he's only 4,800 on DraftKings. So I want to throw out do you want? So we can play the red green game. If you want to play either Hunter Henry or Jason Witten, put up the green sign. If you want to play in a flex spot on DraftKings, or if you want to play Joe Mixon, put up the green.
Oh, I want the tight ends. Was that red?
Tight ends, I think I screwed it up. Tight ends are red.
Tight ends are red. I don't want Joe Mixon. So Devin is the only person who is raising the green. Okay. You'd rather do Joe Mixon than this tight end combo. Tell me why.
I mean, he's caught passes out of the backfield, so that's the biggest differentiator is that, in the games that he's caught 3 or more passes in 3 of his last 4 games, the tight ends scare me. I mean, tight ends are extremely touchdown dependent. So the matchup for Mixon is a good one, and they should be up early. Now, to you guys' point, I'll respect it, but they could take the narrative and sit him in the doghouse. But at the same time, he's still the future of this running game. So I think that they'll just throw him back out there and deal with it internally.
Watch the Colts totally crush the Bengals and all of these picks be wrong.
Devin, are they going to be up early because of their passing game, maybe?
I love AJ. I love AJ Green. I'm not disagreeing with that. I just think that Andy Dalton, we've seen this so many times where he's just in a good spot and then he lays an egg. And the worst thing you can be is behind by like 14 or 15 points at the quarterback position when you could have just spent down like $1,000 or spent up $1,000 to get somebody else or $1,500. You can find that elsewhere. And I know we've talked about how difficult it is, but if Goodwin's out, I'd rather go Trent Taylor deep and spend up at quarterback than suffer with Andy Dalton this week.
I just wish I knew he was going to get that kind of action, Devin. I mean, he does have the talent. I don't think anybody is disputing that. But last week, Gio outsnapped him. I mean, how do you juxtapose, especially in cash games?
They also lost by 15.
Yeah, they're not going to be losing this game by 15. So there's that.
Okay, so the week
but
prior,
Hill might outsnap them. To your point,
the week prior, did they win? I'm trying to pull that up on the fly here. Yeah,
yes.
The week prior they beat Buffalo by 4 points, and he had 36 out of 66. So he had 55% of the team snaps. Can they
what
do
about
that
the week
this
before where they won by 24 against Cleveland?
In that week, he had less of the percentage.
Okay.
31 of 61.
So this is a very real debate. This is a very real debate that we could go on and on for.
Yeah.
That's going to happen all weekend. And that's why I want to pose the question. If you have about $5,000 in a flex spot, do you want to go with maybe a higher floor with, say, a Witten, or do you want to go Joe Mixon? I think that's a real decision that's going to be happening Sunday morning for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a fair question. It's a fair question. Yeah, I'm more in the tight end camp.
I'm looking at both. Mixing at a running back, 2 tight ends at a tight end, or a tight end and flex.
Yeah.
Then you have all the money that you want to spend. You don't have to go Andy Dalton, and boom.
Yeah, that you can find savings that way,
boom.
for sure. Yeah. All right, so let's move on. We've got defenses and kickers. John doesn't want to talk about this. Jeff does. Either you other two guys got something you want to talk about defense or kicker wise?
I'll add one late just because I always do.
Great. Ryan, let's talk to you first.
Yeah, in cash, well, maybe it's more GPP because Chicago doesn't want to throw, but New Orleans should make Chicago throw and therefore should be a good call. And then also if you're going super cheap, keep an eye. I think I saw today Washington, 5 of their 6 top offensive linemen missed practice. So if that trend continues, Dallas should be able to get after Kirk Cousins, and they might be a good cheap play.
Good call. Devin, you want to throw yours in here?
No, I'll let Jeff go first.
Okay, Jeff, hit me with your picks.
Well, kicker's going to be interesting this week. You know, I admit I have not looked.
John doesn't believe you.
Kicker is interesting this week because I would have said Jake Elliott if not for the weather. So that's the concern I have now. So I think I'm going to probably lean a little bit towards Will Lutz or just to stay indoors. I'm not sure where else I would go other than that, but I was pretty much dead nuts on Will Lutz. I think the Cincinnati kicker is also in play for 4,600. So I think
Randy Bullock
for 4,600, but he hasn't had any long kicks. So, but if you're going to play it safe, that's probably a safe way to go. But defense, I think the chalk this week are Philadelphia, if you can afford them, Cincinnati, and maybe Seattle. But I think Cincinnati is probably going to be the one that's going to be on the list for a lot of people.
Seattle's price on DraftKings is kind of nice at 3,200, but I like those other two even more. Yeah. Devin, what do you got?
Yeah. I'll start with just if you're playing the Thursday through Monday slate, or if you're playing a Sunday morning slate, start Minnesota. Joe Thomas is out, and this Browns team is an absolute mess. So we don't need to say it. We say it every week, but that's just my little bit. I know Austin's mad that I'm mentioning this, but I don't really care. So the other defense that I'll mention is Carolina. So they're too cheap on DraftKings. They've second most sacks in the NFL this season. And we've seen Jameis Winston have some really bad games, throwing interceptions, and just he's either very good or very bad. So don't sleep on Carolina this week. I typically like to look at cheaper defenses because at the end of the day, sacks, turnovers, touchdowns, are where you get a majority of your points. The actual holding teams to like 14 points, you don't get that many points, and that's why I'm off Chicago or New Orleans, because they're just going to be running. Chicago's going to be running the ball game.
It sounds like Luke Kuechly might be back this week, which will only help that Carolina defense that you mentioned there.
Austin, I'll throw out one more GPP defense real quick, which is this is a much riskier one. But what about the Jets? Atlanta's not looked good yet. And I love John's face. It's perfect. The Jets are going to run the ball a lot, and I think they actually could steal that game against Atlanta. I wouldn't be surprised at all. And if it's inclement weather, I just don't think Matt Ryan's going to do well, and the Jets could force a couple turnovers. So they're cheap, and that's a possibility.
Yeah, Atlanta's a road favorite. That always makes me a little bit nervous.
They only have 10 sacks on the year too.
The Jets.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a risky one, but it's, I can, as a pessimistic Falcons fan, I can imagine.
If you want a super cheap one, just go with Washington, who's actually been very good this year, having the 7th most sacks. So they're only 2,300, so not a bad cheap option.
All right, let's talk about stacks, guys, because we're running over. We have so much fun things to talk about and lots of Bengals to debate. Talk to me about some stacks. John, what do you got on stacks?
I think my favorite stacks that are kind of chalky. Probably Russell Wilson to Doug Baldwin will be one of the more popular stacks this week. But looking over our football guy colleague Steve Buzzard's projections in terms of ownership, the one that really stood out to me as of, again, the Thursday night. Now, these things change, especially as information comes in over the next 48 hours. But the one that stood out to me that I just love is Cam Newton to Devin Funchess this week against Tampa Bay. This team hasn't scored a running back has not scored a rushing touchdown all season, and we're halfway through the season. So it's got to be going through Cam, and we're up against the 32nd, the dead last defense against the quarterback. You've already mentioned earlier in this episode, Austin, that the two starting cornerbacks are both not practicing as of Thursday. So if they don't practice Friday, I don't know what's behind them, but I do know that the 3 starting cornerbacks for Tampa Bay rank in the bottom half of coverage on Pro Football Focus. I mean, this could be an absolute nightmare for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. By proxy, that could actually be something very good for Jameis Winston, who is quietly putting together some really gaudy numbers this season because they've been trailing so much. That said, Cam Newton, according to Buzzard, 5 to 6% ownership, and Devin Funchess 7 versus 6% ownership. I think it's a great call, and these guys are certainly too far under-owned for the type of upside they bring to the table.
Yeah. Devin, stacks. Who are you stacking this week?
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think that, this week is one of those weeks where it's almost like there's no stacks that just pop off the page. Ben Roethlisberger continues to be too cheap. So I like him with Antonio Brown. I haven't heard hardly anyone talk about Antonio Brown, and he continues to be a top play almost every week. I know the Detroit defense is tough. I get it. But he's only 6,000 on DraftKings. So he's not that expensive. He's $300 more than Andy Dalton, and I trust him a lot more than Andy Dalton.
I trust the matchup more.
Well, the matchup is undecidedly Andy Dalton. But right. To me, it's the game script and everything else involved. I would start Ben Roethlisberger over Dalton this week.
Whew. All right. Jeff, you're excited about stacks.
Yeah, I think there's lots of stacks that I like this week, and I'm not even looking at running back defense stacks. I'm looking at the passing game. I mentioned Derek Carr, and talking about ownership, 3% is what he's projected at. Derek Carr to Crabtree and or Cooper. I think those are both great options. And I also like the Buffalo flip side with Tyrod and McCoy, and maybe throw in a receiver. I think that another one that I really like that's going to be – well, I mentioned the Chargers earlier, but they're going to be higher owned. I like the Cam call with John. I also like Christian McCaffrey. They're the Bucs. I know they haven't allowed much on the ground, but they've allowed 4 receivers 4 running backs to catch 5 or more passes. So Christian McCaffrey could be that play, and that could be your cheap running back we talked about earlier that we're looking for some value. But the stack I like the most, and when I say it for last here, is Matthew Stafford. And I think we didn't talk about Detroit much. Pittsburgh has not played a murderer's row schedule. They've played some pretty bad quarterbacks in the season with the Browns, the Bears, the Ravens, the Jaguars, and throw in Andy Dalton too. But the Steelers' defense could be judged as overrated. So you have Detroit coming off of a bye, and you've got Golden Tate, who's injured. So nobody's going to be looking at Detroit receivers. I think you have both Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay as both home run hitters that are potentials for deep threats. I really like Marvin Jones the most here. That's probably who I'd stack with Stafford. It's a safer one.
Devin, you raised the red black-eyed Joe. I don't think Golladay is going to end up playing this week, but is that what you were going to say?
Yikes. I mean, I just went back the past 7 years, and Pittsburgh is averaging 147 yards passing allowed per game. There's not another defense that's been close to that. So I know they haven't played anyone. I get it, but yikes.
So it's a really sneaky play is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I won't have any, so if they go off, I'll lose all my money, but Jeff will win all of his money. So, I mean,
I'll have one stack for Detroit.
Yeah, and if that could work.
Ryan, who else you got left for stacks here?
Yeah, I like a lot of them that have been said already, but building off of Russ Wilson and Doug Baldwin being one of the more popular ones, I think Russ Wilson and Jimmy Graham has some potential. I talked about it last week with Graham against the Giants, but Houston's a little bit of a similar defense. So over 28% of the targets against Houston go to the tight end, which is second most. And over 25% of Seattle's targets go to tight ends, which is sixth most. So we know Graham is an elite, or at least once was an elite red zone touchdown receiver. And actually, Seattle's offensive line very rarely has an advantage in a game, but against Houston's defensive front, Matt Batanti for us on staff does offensive line rankings and says that Houston's is the worst defensive front in the league now after the J.J. Watt injury. So maybe a couple more routes run against a team that funnels targets to two tight ends. So I do like Jimmy Graham there. Not a lot of people are going to be on him, except for you, Austin, who mentioned him as a good price on DraftKings. But so that might be a place where you want to put him while everybody else is on Wilson and Baldwin and a number of other players.
Yeah.
And one other one real quick. This is just before the weather became an issue, I was all over this San Francisco-Philly game. There's so many ways you could go about it. Philly's in this letdown spot between a big win over Washington and the big game against Denver next week. They could get up early. They could go into a shell. They have a bad secondary as it is. There are a number of players you could play in this game. Just watch out for the weather and then stack it kind of any way you want it. We talked Wentz, Jeffrey earlier. We talked Goodwin's out. Maybe Garcon gets even more targets and raises his floor even more. There's a lot of ways you could do it. Kittle's coming off a really bad game where everybody was on him. So and Philly lost a middle linebacker on a second play of the game last week, and Washington's tight ends had a field day. So you could go back to Kittle. There's a lot of options in that game too. So weather permitting, that's something to look at as well.
Yep. I'll throw out two more, and then we'll go to parting thoughts. I've got Phillip Rivers and Keenan Allen matched up against those Patriots. And then this is a GPP play, obviously, but I haven't checked Buzzard's ownership on this. But what about Watson and Hopkins? Will Fuller generally plays the side of the field that Richard Sherman covers. And so I don't think these guys are going to have very high ownership. And Watson's kind of been defying a lot of odds this year. I think you have to consider that upside when you're building a handful of GPP lineups. So those are a couple that I like.
You've got 2% Watson. Yeah, 2 and 5.
2 and 5 for those guys.
Mm-hmm.
Man, the way those guys have been lining it up, I would like to get some ownership in that. All right. Parting thoughts, fellas. Words of wisdom, things you didn't get a chance to mention. Devin, let's kick it off with you. What do you got for parting thoughts?
I think everything's pretty much said. I think I've said almost too much this show, but
you've been great.
The one thing I'll say is don't start Andy Dalton.
Look at John. Perfect. John, your rebuttal. Parting thought.
My rebuttal is going to be, you know what? One of the best things that's written on Football Guys every week are the rushing and passing matchups that don't get seen by enough people. And they're actually written by, I don't know if it's 100% exclusively Devin Knotts, but it is really good stuff.
Shout out to Keith Roberts and Justin Howe on those two.
There you go. So these three guys put together some really good content. I mean, if you're not reading them, you're doing yourself a disservice with regards to preparing yourself for, I mean, so we're sitting here, we're trying to cram everything into an hour, but if you get in there and really look at the personnel matchups, the injuries, the situations, the past performances, they're kind of summarizing this on both running and passing every week for every team and every game. I think it's some of the best stuff that's done on the site, and unfortunately, I think it goes overlooked a lot of times. So while Devin's poo-pooing the rest of us, I'm going to give him a thank you because I think it's really well done.
The best part is that they're free if you sign up with our free emails. So if you're not a subscriber, we actually send those out via email Tuesday or Wednesday nights. So go and check them out, and thank you, John, for the kind words.
Nice.
The high road.
Yeah. Is it count taking the high road if you point out that you're taking the high road about 4 times?
Based on
nothing's personal here. I mean, it's just opinions.
No,
exactly.
Of course not.
We don't worry, everybody. We all love each other.
Yeah, we totally do. Ryan, speaking of love, share some love in your parting thoughts.
I don't know. Stack Seattle. I like Russell Wilson a lot, and follow Juju Smith-Schuster on Twitter. He's the best.
Team find Juju's bike. Jeff, wrap up our parting thoughts.
2 quick thoughts. First off, going back to the buys, we got the first of 2 weeks here with 6 teams on a bye, and we got the London game. We got games on Monday and Thursday, so the slates are small. This is probably the smallest Sunday slate we're going to have, so that's impacting ownership. So you may have a little more overlap. May want to be a little more creative in your rosters, both cash and GPP. So ownership, I wouldn't worry about as much on GPP because it's going to be higher because there's not as many players to pick from. But if you're looking to save value, and we were talking about it a lot this show, consider the cash plus option, which David Dodds loves and a lot of us do as well. Stack a receiver or somebody as a pass catcher with your quarterback. If you do the right combination, that could buy you a little bit of savings to fit in the rest of your chalkier plays to put a solid cash with some upside.
Yep, that's sound advice. That's going to wrap up our show. And guess what? We lowered the price of our subscription. It is now only $35, and that gives you all of our site content. So go check that out over at footballguys.com/DFS. I'm Austin Lee, and I'm signing off on behalf of John Lee, Jeff Pasquino, Devin Knotts, and Ryan Hester. Thank you for watching, and thanks for being a football guy. To check out all of our DFS content over at footballguys.com, click on the icon in front of Ryan's face. To subscribe to our Football Guys TV YouTube channel, be sure to click on the button on John's face. And if you'd like to see our latest video, click below me now.